Okay, so good evening. My name is Catherine Mercier. I am the Torrey Botanical Society Programming Chair. Before we begin, I want to give a little bit of background about the society. So the Torrey Botanical Society was founded in 1867. We're an organization for anyone interested in plant life, from professional and amateur botanists, students, and people who simply enjoy nature. The mission of the society is to promote an interest in botany and to collect and disseminate information on all phases of plant science. And to do that, we hold public lectures like this. We also have field trips. We publish. We also have student grants, which are open right now. So if you're an undergrad or graduate student, we have research grants. We also have I can't see the slides. Training fellowship grant. Oh, and the Andrew Growler local botany award. So if any of your work would fall into some of those categories, make sure you get in your grant application before January 15th, I think is the deadline. We also published the Journal of the Torrey Botanical Society, and I wanted to highlight one of the papers in a recent issue on ponderosa pine response to fire ecology. The response to fire, I think that's a very, we have a lot of fire in New York right now. What's going on? So check out this paper, check out the journal. I think this is the highlighted paper in this issue that's open access. We try and have an open access paper every issue. And I lost my notes now. So the best way to stay updated on everything the Torrey Botanical Society is doing is to become a member, which you can do at torreybotanical.org. You can also follow us on social media. We're at Torrey Botanical almost everywhere: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky. And on YouTube, we're at Torrey Botanical Society. And on the YouTube page is where you can find recordings of all of these lectures. And this one will be up shortly. For the folks on Zoom, if you don't mind keeping yourself muted during the talk, and you can put questions and comments in the chat as we go. And then at the end of the talk, we'll have a Q&A portion. Anyone can raise their hand either physically or with the Zoom feature raising hand, and we'll go through the questions. And if you want to share the talk or simply rewatch it later, it will be recorded and up on the YouTube page. So tonight's talk will be presented by Dr. Lydia Paradiso, who earned her PhD from a joint program between the CUNY Graduate Center and the New York Botanical Garden, where she studied the flora of New York City and the phylogenetics of the deciduous conifer genus Larix. Most recently, she was a supervising field botanist with the Natural Areas Conservancy, collecting data on forest conditions across all 5 boroughs as part of the citywide Ecological Assessment. And she also managed the New York City EcoFlora project while she was at the New York Botanic Garden. She's president of the Torrey Botanical Society, and we're very excited to hear the collection about collection, collaboration, and community science, a history of local botany in New York City.
Thanks, Katie, for the introduction. Thanks, everyone, for coming in person and on Zoom. I'm going to be talking today about history of local botany in New York City. Go here first. Yeah. So so a big part of my PhD thesis was focused on the flora of New York City. When I started working with the EcoFlora project, I was doing a lot of community engagement and a lot of work like that, but I also wanted to figure out how I could incorporate this into my thesis. So what I ended up doing was constructing a checklist of the plants that occur in the city today. I had some historic data points and I did some comparisons to see how the flora has changed over time. And in the midst of that, I also then found all these other historic documents and all of these other sorts of common threads that have existed throughout the past 200, 300, 400 plus more years that have kind of characterized how local botany and kind of botany as a whole has grown in the city and also on bigger scales. So we're going to have a whirlwind today of people and places and plants that have kind of led us to where we are today. So the city has changed a lot over the past 400 years, and even before that. You can see these three pictures, each about 200 years apart, what the Manhattan might have looked like prior to the colonization by Europeans, around 1812, and then current day. So there's been this huge kind of change in the city's landscape, and those changes have been documented and observed by enthusiastic vocational and avocational botanists throughout this period. So I broke this down into 6 different time periods. You can see they're not all proportional, like how long this time period was. But we're gonna, again, I'm gonna kind of go through these on my talk today. We have prehistory to 1609, we have the original local botanists, the indigenous people. From 1609 up until the Revolutionary War, we had our colonial exploration in the New World. In the early days of the United States, developing science in a young nation. We have this, the shortest period in the end of the 19th century, that's the golden age of local botany, where we had a big explosion of activity happening. Towards the first half of the 20th century, we have diversification and professionalization. And then finally, in the most recent time period, we have the ecological renaissance, which is the period we are in today. And so, as I went through all of this, there were a couple common threads that stood out to me as things that could kind of be tied with, oh, sorry, this is gonna come first. So when I was doing the, one of the things I did was this big literature review, that this is something I'm hoping to kind of make available to people, which is basically every possible work I could find that's ever been published on the flora of New York City, whether that was a very short note in a journal or a whole paper, a thesis, a book. And I looked at kind of how the trends have gone over time. And then when I looked at the history, I was kind of able to piece together and see the trends I could see and how many works were being published by decade and kind of how that correlates with what was going on at the time. And so these kind of common threads that I found were kind of, whether or not they were happening or not, kind of correlated with whether there was this high activity or low activity in New York City. And so most of them fit into the C. So we had community science, collaboration, collection, and cultivation of the next generation. So these are all things that are extremely important towards that have kind of kept this local botany going in the city for this whole time. There have been periods when there maybe wasn't so much collaboration or collection going on. And that's reflected in the publications that were made and kind of the historic record that we have for those periods. So hopefully, if these are not things that you already are, you know, aware that are very important, that this will become clear throughout my talk. Make sure I have that. So John Torrey, the namesake for the Botanical Society, in his 1819 checklist of the flora within 30 miles of New York City, he said this: perhaps there is no region more interesting to the botanist or the geologist than that which surrounds the area of New York. And there is quite a lot of unique geography, geology, and ecology that helped shape the landscape that we see in New York City. So we have this kind of underlying geology. The geology is very important for how the soils are going to be. And we have some interesting kind of underlying geology. For example, in this kind of lime green is a serpentinite formation in Staten Island. That is something that's unique in the world. There's certain sorts of plants that grow there that are accustomed to that type of calcareous soil that are not found anywhere else in the city and in the region. And there's also a really strong glacial legacy. So during the last glacial maximum, about 10,000 years ago, when the glaciers started to melt, we were located right along the edge of the glacier called a terminal moraine. That's that kind of green strip there. When the glaciers are melting, they're depositing lots and lots of debris, big rocks, and that ends up with this kind of ridge. And also, as this is happening, the rocks are being kind of scraped. So all of this kind of bedrock is being exposed. There can be some softer rocks that will get worn away, and there'll be certain things that will be exposed. So once the glaciers kind of left, we were left with this kind of post-glacial landscape with kettle ponds, different sorts of terrain, and then this newly exposed area that had been glaciated for a very long time that now could be recolonized by plants that had persisted below that area. Also ecologically, the area is situated in one of the world's largest natural harbors. And at this confluence of these three different ecoregions, so the North America is broken down into a couple different levels of ecoregions that kind of reflect the overall ecology of the area, kind of what the soils are like, what the plants are like. And so we have kind of multiple different types of ecoregions that together back in the pre-colonization, there were tons and tons, over 50 different ecological communities found in Manhattan alone. This is work that Eric Sanderson did with the Mannahatta Project. So this kind of set the stage for this hyper-diverse, hyper-productive area that then, of course, those are the places that people tend to settle the most. They have the most resources, but this kind of, all these different sorts of communities existing all in one very special place. And so we have our original local botanists. There have been about 8,000 years of continuous human settlement in the area. They have found artifacts like arrowheads and such, especially once they started to realize that those kind of things could be found in construction debris, for example. And by 1609, the area was the Lenape later on, once they kind of had to be given this kind of, they became more structured and were being moved out of the area. So they had systems for naming and recognizing plants. They knew where they occurred and kind of the growth conditions that they might grow better or worse under. And there were also lots of ethnobotanical uses when you're kind of relying on the land for all of your resources. You learn how to live with it. It's being very in tune and having, even though maybe there's not this kind of, you're not thinking about the taxonomy and the systematics of the plants, there's still this different sort of system of kind of understanding how things are related to each other, where things might have come from, what they can do for you and what you can do for them. There were also some kind of impacts, even though they were not as large scale as our impacts today on the landscape, impacts of things like hunting, fishing, foraging, and later gardening and farming. And also there's evidence of use of periodic fires to clear understory for navigation, for hunting, and also kind of persistence of these meadow ecosystems. So for example, the Harlem Plains, the area that is Harlem now, was this large open space, and they've done some analyses and modeling to see that in order to maintain that kind of open ecosystem, there would have to be periodic fires. Some of those would be natural causes, but there would also be ones that were set purposefully. And so when we get to the arrival of European colonists in the early 1700s or the early 17th century, we start to see a change in this kind of system that had been working, for, I guess, 6,000-ish years, or I guess 8,000 years still, it's not going to zero. And things start to change. So the 17th century understanding of science was very kind of different from what we understand today in terms of kind of biodiversity, how things are related to each other, whether or not, the plant that you see in England is a different species than the plant that you see in New York. And this time the focus of most of science was kind of on naming, describing, and classifying organisms in whatever kind of way that they could understand. And we're seeing now this kind of system of colonial science working. So specimens and observations were extracted and sent back to European academic botanists, who then were going to produce species checklists and species descriptions. And this presented a couple of problems. first of all, the people who are working on the plants didn't have this kind of understanding of the ecology. They hadn't been there. They hadn't been kind of seen what it looked like. Also, when you're sending plant specimens back across the ocean, they might arrive in a pretty bad state. And what you're looking at might not be a great representation of kind of what is actually there. Also, you only, especially in the early days, had European specimens to compare to. So when you only have kind of a subset of the diversity, and you only think that that's kind of what there is, you're trying to fit what the specimens you're receiving into that framework. You can force it into that framework, but there's kind of more that can be kind of realized once you have a better picture of that. And so what happened then was we have, for example, Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy, who wrote the seminal Species Plantarum in 1753, that established the system of binomial nomenclature. So a species name having a genus and a specific epithet together, kind of describing succinctly and uniquely a specific plant. He had two different kind of groups of people that were feeding into his work. So he had kind of more professional naturalists, people like Peter Kalm, that they would be sent over specifically to collect plants, mostly for kind of economic value. But then if they found some cool stuff on the side, they could also bring that back. But he also depended on community scientists. And in the sense that these were people that were not trained as naturalists or botanists, but found themselves in the colonies and were very interested in botany and natural science, and through different contacts became in contact with Linnaeus and also could send him materials. And so two such people were Cadwallader Colden, the British governor of New York. He was a politician, etc., but he also was very interested in natural science. He sent a bunch of material via another person, Gronovius, to Linnaeus, who then published Plantae Coldenhemiae. This was the first kind of work about plants in New York as well. Besides, like it's a little more north of here. And also his daughter, Jane Colden. She's considered America's first female botanist, not to be confused with the first American female botanist, because she was still British. She was able to communicate her findings about the local botany through her father to Linnaeus. So she's also thought to be the only woman that contributed to some of his works. She wrote an illustrated manuscript that was lost until the 20th century, but now there are some digital images that have been made of it, which are very cool. And so we have this kind of path through Jane to her father, getting things back to Linnaeus. So these are some of the first kind of community scientists, in the sense that they're not professional botanists, but they're still have a better kind of view of the plants than the researcher who was compiling all of this work together. So it was really important contribution to that. So then we have the American Revolution happen. So we now have this new country has been established, and we're looking to establish our own kind of structure separate from the European ones. So there's a lot of growth of lots of different kinds of infrastructure, but in this context, American scientific infrastructure, universities, scientific societies, trying to set up libraries, botanical gardens, museums, all of those kinds of things. So that people that are here can have kind of a home base, they can have community with each other and kind of continue on to bring themselves up to the level of their now peers in Europe. There's also this kind of embracement of like Enlightenment ideals. So there's changes in how they're understanding and classifying and comprehending botanical diversity. It's still far way off from kind of the understanding that we have today, but it's much closer. And when you kind of look through the ways that they've organized plants, they're bearing a little bit more resemblance, that kind of they're understanding the structures that are going on there and how they might relate to each other. Despite this, formal botanical education was still only really attainable through medical school. So there were lots of young men that were going through medical school really to obtain this kind of natural science education. And it's really interesting to see just the kind of what medical school was back then. In the late early 1800s, the graduation fee was $25. You had to be at least 21 years old to graduate, but you could enter the college sooner than that. There wasn't as much kind of long being in school for a very long time. It was a lot more experience-based, and also, learning probably things like Latin and Greek and kind of this classical education built in there as well. So I made this kind of weird animation. Columbia University today, there's been a lot of evolution throughout kind of time. They were very important for a very long time in botanical studies in the city. So before the revolution, we had King's College was established. A little bit while later, we had the King's College Medical School. During the revolution, the school closed, but following the revolution, we reestablished as Columbia College with the medical school attached. This went on for some time, but eventually demand increased for another medical school, and we got the College of Physicians and Surgeons in 1807. After only a couple of years, the Columbia Medical School merged with P&S, as it was known. They effectively were then Columbia's medical school, but they were not officially Columbia's medical school. Oh, we got the Columbia School of Mines there sometime in the middle. So that was kind of engineering and geology was being taught there as well, with some botany. Then we have the College of Physicians and Surgeons officially becoming the Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons in the late 1800s. And Columbia College became Columbia University just a few years later. So it's just some kind of minutia, but there were kind of two schools at once that had professors that were teaching at both schools, that had students at both of these schools that were kind of operating in parallel and eventually as one. So two of these educators, I want to see if I can try this. So two professors of natural history, botany, and materia medica, which was kind of medicinal uses for plants at Columbia College and then at P&S, were key figures in the early history of American botany. Samuel Mitchell, who was also, in addition to being a professor, a congressman for some time, and David Hosack, who was one of his other notable things is that he was the physician for both Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, and he was there as the attending physician at the infamous duel. And so these two men were coworkers. They were very charismatic teachers. They taught on all different kinds of subjects. Botany was just one of them. But one of the big things that they advocated for from the beginning was the establishment of a botanical garden so that they could properly teach their students. There was a lot of plant medicine being practiced, and they had to know how to recognize different kinds of medicinal plants, different kinds of poisons. And they continually were kind of petitioning the state of New York, the university, to help them to establish this. Eventually, they had to take matters into their own hands, and David Hosack helped to establish the Elgin Botanic Garden, named after his homeland in Scotland. So this this ended up being financed mostly by Hosack himself. He purchased 20 acres of land in an area that was about 3 miles north of the city at the time, which is now Rockefeller Center. And they would have students, they would teach lectures downtown, and then take the students uptown to the Botanic Garden for practicals in the afternoon. They would be able to see all different sorts of plants. Over 2,000 species of plants were cultivated there. They had some areas that were naturally occurring when they had set up. There was a bog area, for example, but there also were then these kind of cultivated areas where they set up different sorts of trees, different sorts of crops. He was constantly receiving plants from other people, seeing how they would grow in the area. They also had a greenhouse and 2 hothouses, and very, very large walls, 7 foot tall, 2 foot thick walls surrounding this. I'm not sure if it was surrounding the whole 20 acres, but so it was this kind of little encapsulated area. After 1811, Hosack was no longer able to upkeep the space, and it was passed to the state and eventually to Columbia, which they failed to kind of upkeep it as time went on. And eventually it became actually a really lucrative real estate holding for Columbia. And it was part of they were able to kind of revamp their own operations by, I don't know if they rented or sold to Rockefeller, but that's what there is now. But it was something that seemed to be a thorn in their side for a while, but eventually kind of paid off for them in some kind of way. So a bit of a short-lived place, but an example of kind of the determination of one or a few people kind of creating a resource that was then able to be used by many. We also had the establishment of an organization that if you were here for one of our talks earlier this year by James Lendemer, you learned about the Lyceum of Natural History. So in their kind of efforts to put themselves at the same level as European society, some of the contemporary scientific societies that were established in this period were mostly extending their membership to people with political or social capital of some kind, which many of these young men who were students at the medical school were not. So in January 1817, Dr. Mitchell convened this meeting, which we ended up with 21 signers of this constitution of the Lyceum, all students, graduates, and faculty of PNS under the age of 27. So Mitchell himself was about 53, but all of the rest of the initial group were all young. They did eventually have the membership grow to include lots of different kinds of people. But this was an opportunity for them to kind of share their enthusiasm, share their knowledge, and learn from each other. They had amassed a very large natural history collection, most of which was lost in a fire in 1866 in that building on the right. But again, as James spoke about, there are some pieces of that collection that have been rediscovered that were in fact not lost. So there is still some kind of interesting avenue there for potential rediscovery of additional specimens, now known as the New York Academy of Sciences. So Hossick and Mitchell mentored a lot of students, but there were 3 students in particular that published the first 3 checklists of plants in the city, in the area of the city. The first local checklist was published by Caspar Wister Eddy, who was a nephew of David Hossick. He began his botanical education with his uncle at a young age and published this checklist of plants of Dr. Mitchell's residence out in Nassau County near New York City when he was only 17 years old. He listed the plants that were there along with their common names. And when he finished his medical education, he began teaching also with his uncle at Elgin Botanical Garden. He went on to practice medicine in the Upper West Side and died at a young age. The second checklist, the first checklist of Manhattan, was published by another student of Hossick, John Eaton LeConte. So he published this checklist of plants of New York, of Manhattan Island, 459 taxa, including a handful that he noted as introductions. You'll notice here, he doesn't list the common names, and he also doesn't list the naming authority, which is something that is difficult for kind of piecing together sometimes which specific plant they're referring to, which is why, for example, I didn't include this in my data set when I was comparing to past times, because I couldn't know for sure what some of these plants were referring to. He also went on, not in botany, but in zoology and also the Army Corps of Engineers. And then finally, we have our first New York City area checklist. In 1817, the Lyceum had only been existed for a couple months, and they appointed this committee to produce a local flora. So there were 3 individuals, including John Torrey, Caspar Eddy, and a third mysterious individual, Jerko Nevels, who I haven't been able to find really any information on, other than that was another PNS student. Within a few months, they had completed the checklist, catalog of plants growing spontaneously within 30 miles of the city of New York, which contained almost 1,000 plants that were listed, but also it was noted that there were many areas of the city that were still left unexplored. And so this was the first checklist that included the entire area of New York City. And after these 3 checklists, there wouldn't really be much activity for a number of decades happening in the city itself. because work would start to happen in the rest of the United States, the botanists that were in New York City would be receiving a lot of material from westerly expeditions, and that was where a lot of their focus was, these kind of new areas. And so by the 1860s, Torrey had kind of returned to, he had been living in New Jersey for a while. He returned to New York City and agreed with Columbia that he would give them all of his collections, his library, and his plant specimens to Columbia in exchange for an appointment as a professor emeritus and also housing on the site of the former Elgin Botanic Garden. And so this is kind of a long little quote in here, but basically at that time then, John Torrey was the only kind of research botanist in the city. And there were all of these young people interested in plants who like to tramp over the hills, along the beaches, and through the pine barrens. And his office basically became a gathering place for these people to be able to come and share their enthusiasm and their interest with him. And it really kind of conveys the presence of Torrey as someone, it says, he neither overwhelmed them with his own knowledge nor belittled their own amateur work, but listened patiently to the accounts of their adventure, praised them for their discoveries, and by his geniality and interest, encouraged them to further study. So something to be said, he wasn't advising them to monograph the genus Carex, but just to explore their interests and explore their environment and kind of let that spark them on forward. And so then we enter into our period of the golden age of local botany with the establishment of the Torrey Botanical Club. So on a snowy evening in December 1867, they held a celebration in honor of the 50th anniversary of John Torrey presenting his catalog to the Lyceum. And over here we have, I found this once in a deep dive on the internet, a place card that was for one of the attendees of this dinner. This event would be cited as a kind of foundation for the official formation of the Torrey Botanical Club, which was officially incorporated a few years later in 1871. You can see in this picture, it calls them the New York Botanical Club, which was the original, what was submitted originally. John Torrey was a humble person and tried to resist them naming the society after him. But due to a kind of New York City sidebar where Boss Tweed put his name as one of the original incorporators, would do that sometimes if he thought that a certain kind of institution was going to be particularly lucrative and this kind of corruption, which they caught, and they refused to ratify this act of incorporation, and in the revision were able to change the name to Torrey Botanical Club. And so today, known as the Torrey Botanical Society, the name was changed in 1997, I believe, continues to be the oldest botanical organization in the Western Hemisphere. And through a number of different activities, some of which Katie kind of mentioned before, have really encouraged local botany in the area. So one such is the Bulletin of the Torrey Botanical Club. The Bulletin was started in 1870. It was the first publication of its kind and a valuable resource not only for local botanists, but for botanists worldwide. It had worldwide circulation. Started out as this very hyperlocal publication where there would be short notes and articles about plants in the area, but soon expanding to cover the entire Western Hemisphere. William Henry Leggett was the founder and first editor and publisher of the journal. This is another example of an avocational botanist. He was the head of a private school in New York City and a very good writer, and personally financed for the first, I believe, 10 years of publication of the journal. At the same time beginning an updated version of Torrey's catalog. Now it's known as the Journal of the Torrey Botanical Society. We continue to try to make the journal as accessible as possible, especially in an age of predatory journal practices. We are free to publish with very affordable open access to kind of keep this, our mission of disseminating botanical information to all interested parties. They also have some other publications throughout the years for larger volumes or for Torreya, which once the scope of the journal became larger, Torrey became the section that was dedicated to local botany, that for a time was separate, but then was absorbed back into the bulletin. Kind of reflecting by the mid 1900s, the lowered engagement with local botany. And again, this is another kind of lovely kind of paragraph that the object of this bulletin is to form a medium of communication for all those interested in the flora and to bring together and fan into a flame the sparks of botanical enthusiasm at present too much isolated. This was the part that's nice, that we have chiefly in view the development of a greater botanical interest in our neighborhood and found our hopes of success as much upon learners as upon the learned. So even from the beginning, having this one of the kind of core values being the engagement of everyone, and not just the people who are kind of at the top that know the most, but everyone who is learning kind of having their own unique perspective, especially in this kind of field of ecology where making observations and having kind of experiences are very important. Another important part of the club were field days. Over 2,000 field trips have been organized by the club since 1882. We have here an older photo from 1927 celebrating the club's 50th anniversary in Staten Island. And below we have a more recent photo from 2023 when we had a lichen trip to Woodlawn Cemetery. Some of you guys might recognize yourselves in that photo. In this kind of spirit of collaboration, community science, there's been lots of different partnerships with different organizations, hiking clubs, other botanical organizations, Microscopical Society, birding. And throughout the years, there have also been a lot of really interesting locations, visits to private gardens of members and non-members, research laboratories like the Boyce-Thompson Institute, when it was located down in Westchester, and different nurseries. So the focus not just being necessarily on wild plants, but also on cultivation of plants. And they also would have specific collecting trips for the local herbarium, which is my next slide. So having multi-day kind of trips to the Pine Barrens where the focus was going to be kind of collecting representative plants from that area to take back and have for reference in the local herbarium. Back in the day, we would have announcements mailed to members and they would always include transit directions, mostly trains to start off with, but with the advent of different forms of transportation, cars, subways, and bridges greatly improved kind of access to all of different areas to study. And we have our local herbarium. So the local herbarium was established very early on in 1870 and was hosted in several locations. First at the first vice president of the club's home at 33rd Street, before it moved to Columbia when Columbia was located in the 50s on the east side. It moved up to the College of Pharmacy on 63rd Street before finally moving to NYBG in 1901, a couple of years after they were established. It was kept as a separate collection for a number of years until in the 70s, it was integrated into the NYBG herbarium. There were approximately 65,000 specimens collected that were for this local herbarium. And they really encouraged people to use the herbarium, to use them and also to send in their specimens to kind of collect and contribute what they had found to this. Many people would make donations, especially when they were at retirement or after they passed away. They would kind of obtain a very large collection from someone. And over time, sometimes over 1,000 would be added per year. So it can be difficult to find them now if you don't know what you're looking for, because they are kind of integrated into the larger herbarium, but many of them have this stamp to indicate that. So going back to Columbia, we had, after John Torrey passed, rather than appointing a new professor of botany, they instead had the professor of geology take over some of that responsibility. There were not a lot of courses necessarily being taught in botany, but the society was meeting there at the PNS building frequently. And the professor of geology, oh, the name is not there, John Strong Newberry, was also president of Torrey at some point. And he had two graduate students from Staten Island, Arthur Hollick and Nathaniel Lord Britton, who learned about the society from him and joined and were able to kind of grow into their botanical interests. A cool anecdote from Arthur Hollick talks about how he would travel home to Staten Island from the meetings in Manhattan. There was no boat. The last boat to the island was at 9. So he would take the midnight train to through Bayonne, wake up walk 3/4 of a mile to Kilvan Cole, wake up the man who lived in the shanty there and hire him to ferry me over to Staten Island in a rowboat. Sometimes in winter, the trip was not a comfortable one, but I do not recall that I ever thought it a hardship. I think I merely regarded it as a matter of course. So maybe some of us are a little bit soft now with our some more modern transportation, but just goes to show kind of the dedication that there was to kind of being in this community and not seeing it as something that was a big drag. The two men would publish the Flora of Richmond County in 1879. Okay, so then Nathaniel Britton would go on to become a professor at Columbia. He would eventually become the next official professor of botany. He organized the collections that had been left there by Torrey and kind of presented them to the administration, kind of ready to go. He's like, you guys don't have to do anything, you have to just appoint me. In 1888, in a move similar to that in 1817, the club appointed a 6-person committee, 3 more people than in 1817 when the Lyceum had appointed 3 people, to prepare a list of plants found within 100 miles of New York City. This included Hollick and Britton, as well as some other members of the club. This was completed within 5 months and lists over 2,000 species of seed plants. Again, they mention that this is the effort of many people's observations over time, that they were referencing the local herbarium and that they wanted this to kind of serve as a jumping off point for people to send them more information so that this could kind of continue to be developed and continue to serve as a source for local botanists. And another big triumph of the club was to finally establish a long-term botanical garden in the city. So starting with Mitchell and Hossick back in the early 1800s, there had been this kind of long-term desire and kind of need for this centralized institution to kind of fund research and be a place that people could do research. And what ended up being the biggest kind of push were a series of articles in the New York Herald in November 1888 was the first one, where they're disparaging the city. They're like, we're laggards in botany. Other places in Europe have botanical gardens and we don't. Why is that? And so the members of the club saw this article. They had a meeting. They said, we have to write a response. They wrote a response that was also published in the New York Herald. And a little while later, the legislature said, okay, if you can raise a certain amount of money, we can match it and we'll give you some land that we've set aside for city parks. So they had a public fundraising campaign. They attracted some wealthy donors' attention, some like the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, et cetera. They had ladies' luncheons to try to raise the money. This was something that was never realized to have some kind of arch similar to Washington Square Arch in the Botanical Garden. But they were eventually successful in establishing the New York Botanical Garden in the Bronx, 1895. Columbia would transfer their entire botany department, including their herbarium and their botanical library, to NYBG and have established a partnership there with graduate students. And another botanic garden, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, would also open to the public a couple years later in 1911. And so this was big triumph for the botanical community in the city, but this also kind of marked a turning point in the activities at the local level. So professionalization and this kind of institutionalization drove research forward, but it also created this, widened the gap between academic and amateur botanists. When most of science was focused on describing and naming and observing natural phenomena, that was very accessible to really anyone. But when we started to have this kind of diversification of science with more technical branches, instrumentation heavy, math heavy fields, that became a lot less accessible to someone who was just interested in it. Maybe you had to know the right people, you had to have a little bit more money, you had to have more education, more credentials. So this kind of started to break down some of that, these kind of collaborations and kind of intimate links that had been happening for so long in the local botany scene. And also just because there were so many different things to research now, there were less people focused on floristics and systematics, which is something that continues to this day. There's not necessarily less to discover in those fields, but there's so many different fields to work in that we've got the kind of less concentration of people in those floristics and systematics. Also, increasing urbanization is a huge problem. At first, Manhattan Island furnished many interesting localities for rare plants, but as the city grew, the wild conditions that so delighted the field worker were pushed further and further from the center of the city. Also, with this institutional support, there was an increase in focus in the American West and in the tropics. Now that there were these institutions that could kind of send off these big expeditions, this was kind of the new sexy areas to research rather than this kind of urban area that wasn't really seen as kind of a space for interesting plants. Fields of ecology were still not recognized. Things like Robert Moses and all of the construction of different bridges and roads and tunnels had a huge impact on the city, as did, you can see this kind of industrial map that shows how many different kinds of ecologically destructive industrial practices were happening at the time. You can see why people were turning towards other areas. Torrey Club continued to have field trips, but 80% of them were outside of the city. Run out of time, but we're going to see what we're doing. Even though we had a decrease in activity in collaboration with different people, we have a lot of some interesting things going on. In 1950, the population flora in New York was a student of Nathaniel Britton. He worked at NYBG, and also as the Torrey Field Chair. He was interested in biogeography, the distributions of plants and how that could be explained by we didn't know about necessarily things like plates moving around, the more immediate effect of soil factors would kind of show, like, would reflect. He also listed help from series of articles in journal where he went through specific plants and he said, I know where it's found. I have some specimens from this certain place. Is it found here? Is it occurring? For some of that information to integrate into actual publication. My second data point, here in the Raymond Torrey, this relation to John Torrey through one of their kind of early ancestors. He was a writer, activist, hiker, and botanist. Besides with society, he a newspaper column, long round, was very popular engagement and with conservation. Influential in this the Appalachian Trail of the New Jersey Trail, and also was an advocate for preservation of tenure of years as chair. There's even this of a patient with Robert Moses that ultimately the plan that he had in. He died suddenly at a young age, but had on kind of conservation out north. I'm gonna go over in 5 minutes. We finally reached last period, the ecological renaissance. So starting in the 1960s, local botanical activity started to regain traction with increased awareness of nature and biodiversity and kind of ecology also kind of emerged as a field in its own right. So we start to have an increase again in opportunities for involvement, scientists, field work, specimen collection, and this kind of new environmental advocacy. So some organizations that I'm going to that kind of came in this post this ecological renaissance period had different ways that they took to do their work. So the organization and the Botanical Society. Protectors of the Pine Oak Woods is an organization founded in 1976, still active today, that's focused on conservation of Staten Island. And a lot of us in the early years focused on environmental advocacy. First to clay pit ponds, then expand throughout more of Staten Island. And their activities in stewardship, management, conservation, and activism. And also some members of any specimens in the Staten Island Museum Herbarium there as a record of what was looking at. The Botanical Society, founded in 1986, they're more focused on forensics. The Long Island, which includes city. One of their goals, which will soon be complete, is to produce a flora atlas of Long Island, which historic present day occurrence out the island. And they also letter type of publications and notes reminiscent of the bulletin publications. Call me to then appoint someone to produce a list. So as happened in 1870 and 1888, in 1988, Torrey Club convened a meeting to discuss the state of local and decided that the botanical would spearhead this effort, become known as the New York Ecological Project, to enumerate plants within a 50 radius city. More recently, through a lot of their field work. They were able to fully complete species, but they were completed due to the sudden death of the principal investigator and then the eventual closure of G Science. Also produced a ton of specimens, many of which are somewhat inaccessible in the Brooklyn Botanical Garden herbarium, which is on loan right now at NYBG. But those are there and are a very valuable resource, more collected in the area, which has been done as much as it has been done. All right. So last couple of years, Columbia discontinued joint program in the late 1960s. We soon found new educational partners in Women College. At the time, was the uptown campus of Hunter College. This extended to partnership with multiple CUNY schools as well as other area universities. Interestingly, The activities that would focus on NYC floristic ecology wouldn't necessarily come that joint program NYBG, rather through some other ecology programs at CUNY. You can see there were where we have 6 theses that were published all in 2000 later that focused on some of them would focus on and look at kind of the changes in history, like, historical ecology up to present day, where others would kind of look at the so look at just the interaction in contemporary. Did lots of questions that the Brooklyn Herbert. This information changes over time. There were 2 publications that found similar loss of native species over time, only on Staten Island and then in the whole state. I also unpublished found a similar percentage, 40% native taxon loss over the past 2 centuries. To see kind of different studies kind of come to the same conclusion. Maybe a conclusion that's not super awesome, but it also still does show that other 60% native taxa have persisted throughout time, throughout all these different. Finally, to mention the Parks Department, Natural Areas Conservancy, to kind of highlight some of this work that's been done in slightly different sectors than kind of the academic. So the Parks Department performs ecological restoration, management, and monitoring, but there are some things that prevent them from doing certain things. Lack of time, resources, manpower, and also constrained by the organization goals. Become this disconnect between the botanists, New York City parks that are working in the field, and more academic botanists at NYBG or at different universities that there have some really great instances of people in with each other and sharing the knowledge and data collected and their time and resources, but that can always be done more. Also, the Conservancy, a profit that works closely with New York City parks, they're able to overcome some constraints. The parks as a governmental organization. I was participated in this ecological assessment that's been repeated 10 years later to look at changes over time. Finally, they've published some management frameworks and support initiatives with CUNY. Project is a recent iteration of kind of all of these past projects to. Now we can do it. Thank you. With digital technology. So in the past, we were soliciting people to send in their specimens, send in their observations. Now we can collect them right from the internet. Okay. And so what does the future hold? We're not really sure what the future holds. There's a lot of uncertainty in different areas, but it's important to keep in mind these 4 threads: community science, collaboration, collection, and cultivation of the next generation, because all 4 of these are integral to kind of continuing this botanical legacy that has persisted for 200 plus years. And just to kind of ensure that, to ensure that it's very important that we must ensure that there's still going on. So I didn't get to put too many acknowledgements on this slide, but thank you for your time. I know I went a little bit over. There's so many things to kind of talk about. Oh, I see. The Zoom can only hear if I talk in the microphone. Okay. Is that a new thing? Okay. So I will open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions in person or on the Zoom. Thank you. Well, there actually, it's interesting. Is this working? Okay. Yes. So Katie's question was if I had, is there a document that I would really love to have? Is that what you mean? Yes. So I realized pretty quickly that when you have letters, you only get, if someone collected all their letters, you only have the letters the person wrote back to them, and you don't have the letter that they sent to the person. So, and they're sometimes housed in completely different places. So for example, we have at NYBG, all of the letters, John Torrey's letters that he received. But if you want to then see the letter that kind of came in the middle that he wrote to that person, you have to find, hopefully they kept it and they have it in their archives. So for example, Asa Gray has his records at Harvard. And so you can kind of go back and forth and kind of read one letter and then read the other letter. And so there's some that are just missing that I really want to know kind of what the other person said, because some of the letters get very juicy. And once you can decipher the handwriting. So some of those lost letters would be really cool to have. Yeah. All right. So the question was I able to get a kind of sense of the average botanical knowledge of New Yorker 100, 200 years ago? I would say it was definitely a lot. Well, there were probably still lots of people that totally didn't care. But I think that it was definitely a lot more present in people's minds. They would have field trips where like 50 people would come on the field trip. I think part of it had to do also with, besides like diversification, I was talking about diversification of science, but just diversification of like extracurricular activities. I think when there wasn't, maybe you couldn't go to the movies or play video games or all these other sorts of things, like there was a lot of these kind of like outdoor clubs, naturalist clubs that were happening. And when it was also like going back even further in like the 1800s, it was kind of fashionable to be into like natural science, like with the Victorians and stuff, for example. There was like kind of like fascination with all that kind of thing. So, and being built into medical education too, just kind of like incidentally had that a lot. I think that in a lot of, I mean, there's definitely been kind of a uptick probably more recently in schools, but I know like I didn't really learn much in my kind of like early education. So they had some partnerships with some teachers institute, like teachers organizations also, in that one of the things where they were talking about, we want people to come and use the herbarium. The local herbarium, they specifically had like a partnership with some kind of local educators organization that they were like trying to workshop with the teachers and stuff like that too. So, and that's something we've been talking about doing with the society as well, to kind of get back into some of that, like doing more kind of outreach and education. Yes.
Rich is
Yes, good question. So the question is, how kind of unique is this kind of extensive and rich history compared to other cities? So especially in the Northeast, so Philadelphia and Boston probably have like rival in terms of the amount of activity that happened, especially because there was the Philadelphia Botanical Club and the New England Botanical Club. But I think by virtue, compared to the rest of the US at least, of being a city that was established earlier and then being this kind of hub where it was not just kind of the local botany that was being done, but also kind of broader botanical activity, things were being sent back, that kind of helped with that a lot. And just the Torrey Society kind of having so much documentation over time and having this like, publication focused on local flora, I think definitely really helped with that too. Mhm.
One could argue New York City was still in it started to because Columbia City University was still hundreds of Botany. So it came out of New York. Spread west, many biodiversity started in New York City with Torrey certainly got us everything than the rest of the town, and it was excellent, kind of a Victorian. There's many people, including women on campus, so this is the way it worked. And his wife for the biology vocation. So really, biology started here, and of course, the Torrey Botanical Society, society, had members coming over and you're slaying letters of still thank Torrey because of the first section of it.
Yes. For the folks on Zoom, there was just some discussion about kind of New York City being the center of academic botany with all of the individuals and institutions that were here. That also helps with that. Yes. Are there any questions from Zoom? Yes. Yes. So TF Allen was, what I can say in context of this, he was the first vice president whose home housed the local herbarium at first. That's all I can say right now. I know more things about him. He was really into algae, I want to say. Yes, lots of things flying around in my head. Lots of people, but yes. Is there another question from online or okay? All right, Molly. Yes. Yeah, so Molly was asking about whether there's any other like places that have smaller herbaria, just they're like kind of local compared to having everything be at NYBG or BBG. And that's something that was also in the past, a lot of people had personal herbarium collections that would only kind of make it into those repositories once they maybe donated them. And I think probably a lot of small institutions are, maybe it feels daunting to kind of set up something like that to have, but even right, just one cabinet. And you don't even need a real plant, to dry plants can be done really low tech. That would be a really cool thing to have. Kind of set up as like a teaching collection that they're ones, specimens that people can kind of touch and handle and be able to see. And kind of all the art that can be done in that too, and kind of see the, have that be reintroduced as like a method for people would be definitely be pretty cool. Yes. Yeah, that's true.
If I can, the Torrey's and
Yes, I'm just going to repeat that because that was good. That, herbaria are regional. And so that's kind of the very important kind of application of them. And so sometimes combining them maybe isn't letting them be used to their fullest potential necessarily. And that having those can kind of reinvigorate interest in your local plants. Yes. Yes, having that like use of iNaturalist is kind of almost right, serving as a proxy for some of this collecting that's happening and being able to collect all the things in one spot. But then, right, the key is then circling it back around to having those, still having those, not having it replace the physical collections, but kind of supplement them or enhance them. Anyone else have any questions? Yes. What if it ends? Okay.
But if there's one thing you want the audience to take away, like one message people to walk away from it, from the talk.
Okay, so Katie's wants to know what's one thing, if there's one thing I could communicate to everyone. I think that it's the power of an individual can be really large. There were certain periods of time in the history when there was one or two people that were the only ones publishing on the flora of New York City. And they were the ones, you know, maybe inspiring kind of the future generations. And that's what's really important, is to kind of continue on. So if you think that, you know, your work is not very important or not very groundbreaking, you might be wrong. And even if it is something that's maybe quite you feel it's quite mundane, kind of being out there and inspiring other people can kind of also be that real big impact. So keep that in mind. And thank you everyone for coming in person and on Zoom.